So hey guys, and welcome to episode 12 of Weekly Kaiju Reviews. And not only is this episode 12, this is episode 1 of a 5-day special I'm doing, in which I'm looking at Godzilla's designs throughout his 60 years on screen. And I've picked one suit from each era, pretty much, that I think shows the most change. And I'm going to be talking about what those changes meant and how these changes help the character. Now, the eras I'll be looking at are, of course, the Showa, Heisei, Millennium, and Legendary, as well as this first figure, which is technically part of the Showa era, but he was his own standalone thing, as the Godzilla who appears in all the Godzilla films of the Showa era after this one are technically a separate kaiju, and that this guy was a sort of standalone Godzilla that appeared in the first Godzilla film only. So we're going to dive straight into Sculpt and have a look at this, which is known as the ShodaiGoji suit. So while I look at Sculpt in this figure, I'm also going to talk about the design choices, of course, and we'll start off by looking at the head. Now, first of all, Sculpt, the head is very, very nicely done. It captures the character perfectly, it's got all the right sort of detailing, etc. So let's just talk a little bit about the design. It's quite a fierce-looking Godzilla design, to be honest. I think it's one of the more serious-looking designs. I mean, the face is a little bit silly when you look at it from the front, but I think from the sides, it's got quite a menacing look to it. And of course, this was the first appearance of Godzilla on screen, so nothing like this had been seen before. And obviously it was a more seriously toned film. The film was a lot darker than pretty much all the films that came after it in the Showa era. Things didn't get serious again until sort of the Heisei era, really. But yeah, I think facially it's a pretty great design. I've always liked the big thick eyebrows it has that almost look as if they're a different skin texture. They look slightly more armoured. I like that about it. And I've also liked this kind of muzzle he has of the chunky cheeks and chunky upper lip. But yeah, as I said, from the front he kind of looks a bit goofy, but I've always liked this design from the side. I think it's got a good profile. And again, just talking about Sculpt of this particular figure, very nice. You obviously got the detailing of the scales that lead onto the spines here, and you've got the varying skin textures. Now, the first Godzilla, this guy here, didn't so much have scaly skin. It's just a sort of thick, leathery look to the skin, not so much scaly as some later incarnations of Godzilla. Which is interesting, because it gives him a sort of unique feel, and it kind of helps to differentiate him from the rest of the Godzillas in the series. If we move down to his chest now, you can see he's still got the same sort of skin texture, and it's not as prominent in this design, but it will become a lot more prominent in later designs, but you can see a slightly pronounced chest bone. You can't really see it from the front, but you can see this little chest bone here is ever so slightly pronounced. Now that becomes a bigger thing in the design of the character in slightly later suits. But yeah, it's worth noting that it does kind of have it here. It's just very, very, very minor. But yeah, you can see he's got kind of a big chunky torso to sort of go with his slightly chunky face. But what's interesting about this first era Godzilla is that his arms are quite thin and quite scrawny. If we look at his wrist on this arm especially, you can see how thin that is in comparison to the rest of his body. And I've always thought that was interesting in the first film. So, you know, he had a lot of weight to him, but it was all sort of lowered down. But his arms did have a more human feel in this film, I think. And I think that was another interesting part of the character. If we just look at the arms on the sculpting quickly, quite nicely done. The only problem I have with the sculpting on this figure, of course, is they've molded it in such a way that he should really be posed like this constantly. And then when you change the arm positioning, you get these sort of bad lines here where the mold should be sat like that. But if you move it, you can see that obviously it's out of place, which is a little annoying. It's slightly less prominent on this arm. It doesn't matter so much with this arm, but this left arm particularly is a real pain. But as long as you keep it like that, it's not too bad. Let's quickly just talk about the dorsal spines. I'll always love this on this design. You've got these very, very small, sort of harder looking spines here before you've got these 3 rows. Now, one thing I will point out, this fin should be further that way, but mine seems to have been a little bit smashed up in the mail. I'm not going to fault the figure for that because that's the postage's fault, not so much the fault of Bandai. But no, they're nicely done. They're very nicely shaped. These are the sort of older, sort of slightly more maple leaf shaped ones, which is cool. If we go down to his sort of stomach and lower and upper legs, his thighs, you can see that you've still got the same sort of skin texture. It's all quite simple, but all quite nicely done. He's got the sort of the knobbly knees that look as if they've been hardened over the years, and then you've got his chunky lower legs. And the design of the feet here is another thing to mention. The 3 toes at the front and the 1 at the side. Now this does reoccur, but not for quite a while in the eras. So you just bear that in mind. We'll be having a look at another figure later on that has a same foot design there. But yeah, overall the sculpting is really nice. The detailing is quite simple, but it's not badly done at all. Not in the slightest is it badly done. And I think that's good in a way because it sort of perfectly reflects the character. You know, this is the first Godzilla, the first sort of big lizardy kaiju. There obviously were kaiju films beforehand, but this is the first one that brought it into the mainstream. And he's just such an interesting design, and he's become a cliche over the years, I think. And you know, with so much popularity, he has kind of become a bit of a cliche. But I think this original design is very interesting, and especially the sort of the bulk of it, because he almost looks quite clumsy. You know, like he's quite a fat kind of monster. He's big, powerful lower legs, but these tiny little arms and stuff. But yeah, the first film really captured how frightening something like this could be, and I think this figure, the sculpting on this figure especially, has really captured the look that they were going for with the original Godzilla. In terms of paint job, this figure's pretty simple again. Obviously, the film that this Godzilla was in was entirely in black and white. They may have done a coloured version since, I'm not quite sure. I do remember, though, of course, that this film was originally in black and white, and that kind of is quite telling in this figure. There is some colour, though. Like for the most part, this figure is grayscale, which is really, really nice, and it fits in perfectly with the film. The only thing about this figure that takes it out of being grayscale is, of course, the detailing in the mouth. But the rest of it, for example, the claws are white, well, sort of grey, actually. These are all grey. Everything about it is sort of black and white, basically, and that's really nice. The base colour of the vinyl is this sort of grey, and then obviously they've highlighted certain areas with this sort of slightly white, on the chest bone and the knees primarily, and on the spines, etc. And it's very minimal, but it gives it a sort of smoky colour, and it gives it a sort of grayscale colour. And that's spot on. I think that's really, really good, other than the mouth, obviously. But I suppose if I wanted a figure of the 1954 Godzilla, I would want it to fit in with the rest of my Godzillas. So if it was purely black and white, it would seem out of place. So I like that it is mostly, but they have given it that little bit of colour to help it fit in with the rest of the Godzilla figures. So yeah, I'm really happy with this design. And the sculpting and the paint are both very minimal, but I think they've really accurately captured the monster whilst giving it something a little bit new with the colour. Now, in terms of articulation, most of the figures of Godzilla himself are pretty simple and pretty similar. So if we have a look at the articulation on this 1954 Godzilla, he has 1 point of articulation at the head. He has one at this arm that would go all the way, but he gets stuck on his hip. And this one here that would go all the way, but again gets stuck on his hip. Now, he has not a tail articulation, but it's not here where you'd normally expect it to be. It's over here. And then he's got articulation at the legs, which don't go 360 degrees because of the moulding of the body. This one sort of goes to about here, and this one goes to about there. So this one doesn't get much movement out of it. This one you can get a lot of movement out of. But yeah, the sculpting, sorry, not the sculpting, the articulation is good. It is a little stiff on the legs, and this arm is a bit loose. Yeah, this arm's pretty loose, But other than that, it's not too bad. You know, it's alright for what it is. And I suppose they've tried to do something a little bit different with the sculpting, so because of the way it's sculpted, I wouldn't really want to articulate it much because it leaves, you know, these sculpting lines on the arms, etc. So, yeah, I think the weakest point of this figure, to be honest, is the articulation. But it's not particularly bad, it's just not as nice as I would maybe like it to be. So this figure is by Bandai Creations, which is obviously the American range. And I picked this figure up over the Christmas period for £28. Well, my parents picked this up for me actually as a Christmas gift, but I know they got it from Amazon, and it's going on Amazon at the moment for 28 quid. So I think that's pretty. It's a little steep, I think, for a Bandai Creations figure because a lot of collectors aren't huge fans of the Bandai Creations range. I don't mind them. I think they're more or less the same sort of quality as standard, but yeah, if you're not a huge fan of the Bandai Creations line, then it might be a little bit steep for you. I think it's pretty reasonable for this figure, especially as, you know, a lot of the other 1954 Godzillas I've seen don't really have the correct body size. So I think this one really captures it quite well, and I think this one has a real nice look to it. So I think I would really recommend this figure for that price, and if you can get it cheaper than that, then that is awesome. So yeah, I would say 28 quid you can definitely get it for, but I would say try and get it for maybe 25. So overall, Godzilla 1954. First of all, would I recommend the figure? Yes, I definitely would. I think it's a really good figure. I think it captures the monster perfectly. And that brings me on to what do I think of the Kaiju itself, the original 1954 Godzilla. Well, it wasn't the first Godzilla film I saw. The first one I saw was Godzilla vs. Gigan. So it's not the first design of Godzilla I ever saw, but I think it is a classic, and I think what this film, Godzilla 1954, was a lot darker, and it had a lot more of a frightening feel, especially for me as a kid when I did finally watch it. It was a lot more frightening, and it was a lot more out of place. I mean, having seen the slightly happier, slightly funnier Godzilla films of the Showa era first, it was interesting to see, and it was actually quite frightening the first couple of times I saw that 1954, because it was such a different feel. It was so serious, and there were so many scenes in it that were very very frightening. Like there's a lot of scenes of like piles of bodies, and there's a very bizarre sequence where a choir of girls sing. It's such a weird and such a fantastic film. So yeah, the figure I highly recommend. The film itself I would also highly recommend. And while I don't think it's the best Godzilla film in the series, it's obviously one of, if not the most important Godzilla film. So yeah, that's pretty much all I've got to say about Godzilla 1954 for the time being. Tomorrow we'll be having a look at the Showa era suit, and the suit I've picked for the Showa era is the So Shingeki suit, and I will sort of explain my reasonings for that tomorrow. So thanks for sticking around, guys, and I'll see you tomorrow for part 2 of this 5-day Godzilla special.